Regency, England, a second daughter is not a person, she is a contingency. A plan B her family keeps in the back drawer, in case plan A falls through. Useful in the way that spare buttons are useful. Not something you think about until something else is gone. Frances Ancroft had spent 22 years being useful in exactly this way. She managed the household accounts when her mother's nerves prevented it, taught the younger children their letters, sat quietly at the edge of every gathering because quiet girls at edges do not cost anything and occasionally prevent something worse from happening. She had never been the one anyone planned around. She had been, always, the one they planned with. So, when her father called her into his study at 11:30 on a Tuesday night and told her that Eleanor was too ill to sign anything by morning and that the contract with the Duke of Fenwick could not wait, she did not argue. She did not ask whether this was fair. She looked at her father's face, the face of a man who had run out of options, and she said, "What time do I need to be ready?" She signed the contract the following morning beside a man she had spoken to for a total of perhaps 15 minutes across 2 assemblies and 1 dinner. She looked at her own name on the paper and understood that her life had changed in a direction she had not chosen. That evening at Fenwick Hall, he knocked on her door. She opened it. He asked not what she had been preparing herself to be asked, but something else entirely. She said yes. She did not sleep that night, not for the reason she had expected, but for one she did not yet have a name for. The house in Shropshire had been declining for long enough that the family had stopped noticing the particular stages of its decline and had begun instead to treat condition as a fixed quality, like the color of the wallpaper or the unevenness of the flagstones in the back hall. The roof over the east bedroom leaked when it rained from the northeast. The kitchen garden had been reduced to essentials 3 years ago. The carriage horses were down to 2, and one of them moved with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had earned its retirement and knew it. None of this was new. All of it was, in the specific way of things that have been true for a long time, simply the texture of living in the Ancroft house. What was new in October of 1815 was that the debt had found a name. Not a number. Numbers had existed for years, in various ledgers that Frances had maintained with the methodical care of someone who understood that accurate records of a bad situation were marginally better than inaccurate ones, but a name. A creditor who had purchased the consolidated Ancroft debt from the original lending house, and who had, through his solicitor, made clear that he was prepared to discuss settlement terms. The settlement he had in mind was not financial, it was matrimonial. He required a wife from a family of sufficient standing, and the Ancrofts were, whatever their current difficulties, a family of standing, and he had 2 daughters to choose from. Eleanor was the elder. Eleanor was also, by every conventional measure, the more suitable, prettier in the way the season valued, more accomplished in the accomplishments the season noticed, more practiced at the performance of ease that the drawing rooms of Shropshire Spettalter expected from a young woman being considered for a significant match. She had met the Duke of Fenwick twice at assemblies where he had been present and watchful and not particularly sociable, and she had told Frances afterward that she found him cold, which Frances had noted, and that she supposed she could manage cold, which Frances had also noted. The contract had been drafted in September. The signing was scheduled for the first Wednesday of October at the offices of the solicitor Kessel in Ludlow. Eleanor had been fitted for 2 new gowns for the occasion. Frances had ironed them. On the Tuesday evening before the signing, Eleanor's fever began. It was not a dangerous fever. The doctor, who came at 9 o'clock, said as much, with the brisk confidence of a man who had seen a great deal of fever and could distinguish the varieties. He said Eleanor needed rest and liquids and should not, under any circumstances, travel to Ludlow by carriage in the October cold for a legal appointment. He said this without knowing what the appointment was, and therefore without understanding what he had just done to the Ancroft household. Frances understood. She sat in the corridor outside Eleanor's room and listened to the doctor's footsteps on the stairs and the sound of her father's voice below, low and urgent, and she knew before he called her name, before she descended the stairs, before she stood in the doorway of his study and saw his face, that the solution had already been decided and that she was it. "It cannot wait," her father said. He did not say he was sorry, which she respected more than she would have respected the apology. "Kessel's office has been informed. The terms do not change. If we do not sign tomorrow, the offer is withdrawn and the debt is called in by the end of the month." "I understand," Frances said. "You will need to be ready by 7:30. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the expression of a man who knew he was asking something he had no right to ask and who had no alternative to asking it. She did not make it harder for him. She went upstairs, sat at her small writing desk, and looked at the window for a while. And then she opened the household ledger and balanced the accounts for the week, because the accounts needed balancing and because having something precise to do with her hands helped her think. She thought about the Duke of Fenwick, whom she had observed at the same assemblies Eleanor had attended, and about whom she formed opinions that were different from Eleanor's. Eleanor had found him cold. Frances had found him attentive in a way he appeared to be making some effort to conceal, which was a different thing entirely. She had watched him listen to a conversation about agricultural drainage at the Bexley dinner with the focused interest of a man who cared genuinely about drainage, and she had thought at the time that there was something clarifying about a person who did not pretend to find things interesting that they did not find it interesting. She had thought about it briefly, and then stopped thinking about it because it was not relevant. It was relevant now. She put down her pen and went to bed and did not sleep well, which she had expected. The solicitor's office in Ludlow smelled of coal, smoke, and old paper, and the clerk who showed her in had the carefully neutral expression of a man who had been asked to pretend that this situation was ordinary and was managing it with professional competence if not complete conviction. Thomas, her brother, sat to her left, holding the Ancroft family's copy of the draft contract with the stiff back of a man performing dignity under pressure. Frances sat in the chair indicated and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the door. Augustus Vane, the Duke of Fenwick, came in at 9:05. He was taller than she had registered from across assembly rooms, and the quality of his attention was, in a small office rather than a large hall, more difficult to overlook. He looked at her father first, and then at Thomas, and then at Frances, and his expression did not change. Not a flicker of surprise. Not the slight adjustment of a man recalibrating his expectations. He looked at her with the same focused consideration he had given the drainage conversation at the Bexley dinner, and he said, "Miss Ancroft," and sat down. She filed this away. She did not have time to examine it yet. The signing took 23 minutes. The solicitor read the material terms aloud in the manner of a man who had read them many times and found them neither remarkable nor interesting. The debt was discharged. The Ancroft house was secured. Frances would take up residence at Fenwick Hall within the week. She signed where she was directed to sign. Augustus signed beside her. She did not look at his face while he was signing. She looked at his hand, which was steady and unhurried, and wrote his name with the compressed precision of someone for whom a signature was a functional act rather than a performance. She was in the carriage back to the Ancroft house before it fully arrived. She was married. The paper was signed. She was going to Fenwick Hall in 4 days, to a house she had never entered, with a man she had not chosen, who had not, by any outward evidence, been surprised to find her there instead of her sister. Thomas sat across from her and said nothing useful for the entirety of the journey, which was 40 minutes, which she used to look out the window at the October fields and practice, in the manner she had developed over years, the art of feeling something fully and not allowing it to organize her face. She arrived at Fenwick Hall on a Friday afternoon, with Nan beside her and two trunks behind, and the first thing she saw was the scaffolding on the north wing, and the second thing was Augustus Vane, standing in the entrance without his coat, talking to his land agent about something to do with the upper pasture drainage. And the third thing when he looked up and saw the carriage was that he ended the conversation with the land agent in one sentence and came across the gravel with the directness of a man who does not perform arrival ceremonies but understands they exist and intends to fulfill his portion of one. He showed her the house himself, which she had not expected. He was not a natural guide. He showed her things in the order he thought of them, rather than in any spatial logic, doubling back twice, and he described rooms by their function rather than their aesthetic. And when she asked about the portraits in the long gallery, he said he could identify about 2/3 of them with confidence, and the rest were, in his opinion, probably relatives of someone. She found this obscurely a relief. He showed her, last, the library on the east side of the house, which was a large room with tall windows and shelves that had not been properly organized since his father's time, and a collection of materials that included, he said, a significant number of musical manuscripts and instruments that he had not catalogued and did not know how to catalog. He said this without apology as a statement of fact. She looked at the shelves, at the instruments visible through the glass of two large cabinets, at the manuscripts stacked with the disorganization of the things that have been added to over decades without a system, and felt, for the first time since her father had called her name in the study on Tuesday night, something that was not dread. "I could do that," she said. He looked at her with the focused attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he was thinking about seriously. The cataloging. "Yes, I can read the notation systems. Older instruments have maker's marks and date codes that require some knowledge to interpret, but I have some. More than some, I expect," he said. And the observation was not flattery. It had the quality of a man updating a data point, but it landed differently than flattery would have. And she turned to the shelves before her face could do anything she had not authorized. Dinner was at 7. They ate at the ends of the table, built for more than two, which suited them both, she thought, in ways that were probably telling. He asked her 2 questions about the Ancroft house's land management and listened to the answers with genuine attention. She asked him 1 question about the north wing scaffolding, and he answered it in more detail than she had anticipated. By 8 o'clock, they had covered the drainage situation, the state of the east pasture fence, and the question of whether the library's east-facing windows were causing humidity damage to the manuscript paper, and she thought, "This is a conversation I could have again." It was at 9:30 when she had gone upstairs and changed and was sitting at the small desk in the room that was hers, looking at the unfamiliar angles of an unfamiliar ceiling that the knock came. She stood. She crossed the door there. She opened it. He was still dressed, coat and all, which told her he had come directly rather than retiring first. He looked at her with the same directness he applied to everything else. He said, "I wanted to ask the East Library, would you prefer to begin the cataloging tomorrow, or would you rather start with the household accounts? I have been told the accounts are in reasonable order, but I confess I have not looked at them recently." She looked at him. The corridor was lit by a single lamp behind him, and the light made his expression difficult to read precisely. But the way he was standing, not filling the doorway, not leaning into the space, but standing at a small and specific distance that was clearly intentional, told her that the question was as simple as it sounded, and as deliberate, and that the answer mattered to him in a way he was not going to explain. "The library," she said. He nodded once, the nod of a man filing a confirmed answer. 8:30, if that suits." "Yes," she said. He went back down the corridor. She stood in her doorway and watched him go, And then she went inside and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and did not sleep for a long time, not from distress, not from what she had been bracing for, but from the specific unfamiliar sensation of having been asked, simply and directly, what she would prefer. She was not accustomed to that. She did not know yet what to do with it. The East Library at Fenwick Hall had the quality of a room that had been loved by someone and then left alone for a long time, not neglected, exactly, but paused. The way a piece of music is paused when the player leaves the bench without closing the lid. The shelves held their contents with the particular disorder of accumulation rather than abandonment. Things added over decades by someone who knew where they were putting things, and then by someone who did not, and then by no one at all. Dust had settled in the topmost corners. The two large glass-fronted cabinets along the east wall contained instruments stacked and laid without system, a lute resting against a citern, a set of recorders wrapped in cloth that had dried and stiffened with age, a keyboard instrument of a kind Frances did not immediately identify pushed to the back behind a box of loose strings. She stood in the doorway at 8:25 and looked at it with the assessment of someone who has just been handed a problem that is going to take a long time and is already deciding where to begin. Augustus came in behind her, looked at the room with the expression of a man confirming that it was as he remembered, and said, "I should warn you that there may be mice in the lower cabinets." "There are mice in most lower cabinets," she said. "That is a tolerant view. It is a practical one." She moved to the nearest shelf and tilted a manuscript to read its spine, which had no spine title but a number written in brown ink that had faded to near illegibility. "Do you know the system your father used for the manuscripts?" "I know he had one," Augustus said. "I do not know what it was." She looked at the number on the spine and then at the next manuscript, which to have a different format of number entirely. "He may have had two," she said, "or changed systems at some point. I will need to open several to establish the pattern." She set the manuscript down gently and turned to face the room properly. "I will need paper, a good quantity, and ink that does not skip. I will have it sent up. And somewhere to put things that need more examination than can be done here. Somewhere with better light and a flat surface." He considered this. "The small sitting room at the end of the corridor has a south window. That will do." She looked at the keyboard instrument in the back of the cabinet. "What is the history of that instrument, the one behind the string box?" He came to look through the glass. He studied it for a moment with the focused attention he gave things he was actually uncertain about, which she had noticed was different from the attention he gave things he already understood. "My father acquired it from an estate sale in Norfolk when I was perhaps 8 years old. I recall him saying it was Italian. I did not pay sufficient attention at the time to remember more than that. If it is Italian and old enough, it may be significant," she said. "I will need to examine it carefully. The maker's mark should be inside the case, if it is intact. Then we will need to move the string box first," he said. And he opened the cabinet and lifted himself while calling for anyone to do it, which she also noted. They worked for the better part of the morning, not together exactly, but in the same room, establishing the dimensions of the problem. She examined manuscripts and made preliminary notes in the system she was developing as she went. He moved things when moving was required and answered questions about provenance when he could, and said, "I don't know," without discomfort when he could not. By 11 o'clock, she had a preliminary sense of the collection's scope, perhaps 60 manuscripts, some of them copies and some of them originals that would require more expertise than she had to date precisely, 14 instruments in various states of condition, and one keyboard instrument at the back of the cabinet that she was increasingly certain was neither Italian nor 18th century, but something older and considerably more interesting. She had also, in the course of pulling a bundle of loose manuscripts from the third shelf, found the program. It was tucked between two manuscript pages as though used as a bookmark, which may have been exactly what it was. It was a printed program from a public concert in Shrewsbury, dated September of 1813, 2 years ago, before she had met him, before the debt had found its name. The program listed 14 performers, beside the seventh name Miss F. Ancroft, pianoforte. A circle had been drawn in soft pencil, the kind of circle that is drawn by a person who is making a private note to themselves and does not expect anyone else to see it. She stood with the program in her hands and looked at that pencil circle and did not move for a moment. Then she looked at the room, at Augustus across the space of it, his back to her, examining the label on a wooden case she had asked him to bring down from the top shelf. She put the program in the pocket of her work apron. She did not say anything. She went back to the manuscripts. The rules of the house became clear over the course of the first 2 weeks, in the way that the rules of any house become clear, not through announcement, but through observation. Bess, the cook, held absolute authority over the kitchen schedule, which began at 6 in the morning and proceeded with the regularity of a clock that had been wound by the same hand for 30 years. The household staff had been in their positions long enough to have their own internal hierarchies and communication systems, and Frances was received by them with the careful respect due to a new duchess and the watchful assessment due to someone who was going to be living in their house for the foreseeable future and whose character was not yet established. Margaret, the housekeeper, was 61 years old and had come to Fenwick Hall as an under-housemaid at the age of 28 and had risen over 39 years to her current position through a combination of competence and the kind of institutional knowledge that makes a person indispensable. She showed Frances the house systems with a thoroughness and takes pride in things being done correctly, and she answered questions directly, and she offered opinions when asked, and sometimes when not asked. And Frances found her, within the first week, to be the most reliable source of information about how things actually worked at Fenwick Hall, as opposed to how they appeared to work. Margaret had also, Frances noticed, a way of catching herself mid-sentence on certain topics. It was not protestation, more the slight adjustment of someone who has said a version of something before and is in the habit of checking it before it leaves her mouth. Frances did not push on this, she filed it. Augustus's own rules were fewer and more explicit. He rose before 6 and was in his own study by 6:30, which she respected by not requiring anything of him before breakfast. He ate at the long table without ceremony and read during meals when he had something pressing and did not when he did not, and she did the same, and they had discovered by the end of the first week that this arrangement, which might have looked like mutual indifference, was in fact a form of mutual courtesy that suited them both considerably better than performed conversation would have. Twice in the first fortnight, he asked her opinion about estate matters, once about the east sare fencing, and once about a proposed change to the tenant cottage's water arrangements, and listened to her answers with the attention he gave things he intended to act on, and acted on them, which she found, each time, faintly startling. In the evenings, if neither of them had obligations elsewhere, they sometimes sat in the London library, the main library, not the east one with their respective reading, and the fire and the specific quality of silence that exists between two people who are not uncomfortable with each other. She was aware in these evenings that she was not unhappy. She was not yet certain what she was, but she was clear about what she was not. Rupert Crail arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of November, riding a horse that was expensively turned out in a way that suggested more attention to appearance than to the animal. He was Augustus's cousin on the paternal side, 40 years old, with good manners applied over a personality that Frances assessed in the first 20 minutes of his visit as fundamentally calculating. He greeted Augustus with the warmth of a man who wants something and has decided warmth is the most efficient vehicle for obtaining it. He greeted Frances with the particular attention men of his type directed at women they were evaluating, which was different from interest, and she knew the difference. He stayed for dinner. Over dinner, he talked about the London season, about a property in Herefordshire he was considering, about several people Frances did not know. He asked Augustus about the estate, with the little indirection of someone who wants information about a specific thing and is approaching it from every angle, except directly. When the conversation moved, as conversations about Fenwick Hall sometimes did, to the late Duke's collection of objects, Rupert became more alert in a way he was not entirely successful at concealing. The musical instruments, he said, with the air of a man making pleasant conversation about an incidental topic. Father always said the old Duke had quite a collection. I imagine it's still in the East Library. Frances is cataloging it, Augustus said. Rupert looked at her with the re-evaluation of a man who has just learned something he did not expect. Are you? What an unusual accomplishment. It is a practical one, Frances said, which was what she had said to Augustus about the mice, and which she found covered most situations. I had always understood that several of the instruments were quite valuable, Rupert said. The Italian pieces in particular. He said this to Augustus, not to Frances, which told her he had already decided she was not the relevant person in the room. I recall my father mentioning that there was some question about how they were categorized in your father's will. Personal property or
estate property.
A meaningful distinction, of course. I have not reviewed that recently, Augustus said. He said it with the neutral tone that was his default when he was paying close attention. Of course, Rupert said. No urgency. He picked up his wine. I only mention it because I happened to be speaking to old Kessel's partner in Ludlow last month, and the question came up. Academically speaking, nothing about the way he said suggested academic interest. Frances looked at her plate and thought about the keyboard instrument in the back of the cabinet and what it would mean if Rupert Crail had already been discussing it with a solicitor. After dinner, when Rupert had taken his leave, she went up to the East Library and opened the relevant cabinet and stood for a while, looking at the keyboard instrument in the back and the instruments around it, and thought about the distinction between personal property and estate property, and what it would take to establish which was which. She went to bed resolved to find out. The following morning, she went back to the East Library before breakfast. She had been thinking in the particular way she thought about problems that needed solving not anxiously, but systematically, turning them like objects in her hands to find the angle that revealed the most about the question of categorization, and what documentation might exist to answer it, and where that documentation would be. The estate's legal papers were in Augustus's study. She did not go there without cause. But the library itself, the East Library, had been his father's domain, and men who cared about collections tended to keep records of them near the collections themselves, in the way that people kept records near the kitchen and maps near the door. She began with the lowest shelves, where the manuscripts were thickest and the system most obscure. She worked methodically, removing stacks, reading spines, replacing them. She was on the fourth shelf from the bottom when she found the volume that was not a manuscript. It was bound in brown leather, narrow, the kind of volume a man uses for his own records rather than for formal documentation. Inside, in the late Duke's handwriting, which she recognized from letters Augustus had shown her for comparison purposes during the cataloging, was a running inventory of the collection, not formal, not legal, but detailed, dated, and specific. Each instrument listed by type, acquisition date, price paid, and a one-line note on provenance. She sat down on the floor of the East Library with the volume in her lap and read it from the beginning. By the time she reached the entry for the keyboard instrument acquired 1802 from an estate sale in Suffolk, identified by the seller as Flemish mid-6th century, Purchased for the hall, she understood two things. First, the late Duke had been meticulous and had known exactly what he had. Second, this volume was not the document that would settle the legal question, but it was the document that would tell her where to look for the one that would. She was still on the floor when Augustus appeared in the doorway. He looked at her on the floor with the volume in her lap with no particular surprise, which she was coming to understand was characteristically adjusted to situations rather than reacting to them, which was efficient and also, she was finding, rather calming to be around. His personal inventory, she said, holding up the volume. He came in and crouched beside her, not towering over her, but coming down to the level of the problem, which was the kind of practical instinct she had come to expect from him, and looked at the page she was holding open. He read the entry for the keyboard instrument. He turned back 2 pages and read several more entries. He said nothing for a moment. The distinction Rupert raised, she said. Personal property versus estate property. If your father specifically acquired these for the hall, if that was his intention at the time of purchase, that is relevant. It would need to be established formally, Augustus said. Yes. The will's language will matter and how it categorizes the collection. She paused. I have not seen the will. He looked at her. Not the evaluating look of a man deciding how much to share, but the considered look of someone deciding whether the next step is the right one. Then he stood and held out a hand to help her up from the floor and said, Come with me. They went to his study, which she had not been in before. It was a working room, not a decorative one, the desk deep in papers, the shelves organized by function rather than appearance, a map of the estate pinned to the wall with annotations in at least 3 different inks representing decisions made at different times. He found the will in the 3rd drawer and put it on the desk between them, and they stood side by side and read the relevant sections together, and the language was, as she had half expected, imprecise in the way that legal language is sometimes imprecise when the person who drafted it did not anticipate the specific argument that would later be made against it. Rupert has a solicitor, she said. I know, he said. We will need one as well. She looked at the will and at the inventory volume she had carried from the library. And we will need more than this. Something more formal than his personal notes. A registered document if one exists. I do not know if one exists. Then I will keep looking, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expressions she was accumulating in her understanding of him, the one that was not quite assessment and not quite something else, and that she had not yet classified to her satisfaction. Then he said, 8:30 tomorrow, the library. Yes, she said. She went back down the corridor toward the East Library with the inventory volume under her arm and thought about the pencil circle on the program in her apron pocket, and the keyboard instrument, and Rupert Crail's careful indirection over dinner, and the fact that she had been in this house for 3 weeks and had already found 2 things that mattered, and wondered, not for the first time, whether being useful was the same as being wanted, and whether she was capable of the difference. December came in wet and gray and stayed that way, which suited the work. Frances had established a system by then. The south-facing sitting room at the end of the corridor had become her examination room, the East Library her filing room, and the hours between 9 and 2 her working hours, during which she moved between the two with the purposeful regularity of someone who has found the particular rhythm of a task that suits them. She had catalogued 41 manuscripts, 11 instruments, and 3 items whose categorization she was reserving until she had done more research. The keyboard instrument remained in its cabinet, examined but not yet formally documented, because she was still waiting for a book she had requested, through Kiesels in Ludlow, a volume on Flemish instrument makers from the previous century that she had reason to believe existed, and that would, if it contained what she expected, allow her to date and attribute the instrument with the confidence the situation was going to require. Rupert Crail came back in December. He came twice, once on a Tuesday that he presented as a casual visit, and once at the end of the month for 3 days, ostensibly to discuss estate business with Augustus that could, Frances thought, have been conducted entirely by letter. On the second visit, walked through the East Library while she was working in the sitting room, and she heard him stop outside the glass-fronted cabinets and stay there for perhaps 4 minutes before his footsteps moved on. She did not go out. She kept working. She noted the 4 minutes. On the second evening of his December stay, at dinner, he raised the collection again. This time he was less indirect. 3 weeks had apparently persuaded him that indirection was not producing results, and that a more explicit approach was warranted. He said, with the air of a man raising a reasonable question about a shared family interest, that he had been speaking to a solicitor about the question of the will's language, and that it was his view, informed by this consultation, that several of the instruments, and in particular the keyboard instrument, had been acquired by his uncle in a personal capacity that predated any formal entailment to the estate. The keyboard instrument was purchased in 1802, Frances said. The entry in your late uncle's own inventory notes specifies that it was purchased for the hall. She said this without looking up from her plate, in the same tone she used for factual observations that did not require emphasis. There was a silence. Rupert looked at her, and then at Augustus, and then back at Frances, with the recalibration of a man who has discovered that the person he had categorized as peripheral is in fact central and is deciding how to adjust. A private inventory is not a legal document, he said. No, Frances agreed. But it is evidence of intent, which a solicitor will tell you is relevant to the interpretation of ambiguous whistle language. She picked up her wine. I am also still looking for a formal document. There may be one. Rupert's expression did not change visibly, but something behind it did. He turned to Augustus and said, with the forced pleasantness of a man who has just identified an obstacle he had not accounted for, "Your wife has been thorough." "Yes," Augustus said. He said it with the flat certainty of a man stating something obvious, and something in the way he said it not proud exactly, but settled, as though this were simply a fact that had been confirmed and filed. Frances looked at her plate again before her face could do the thing it was threatening to do. It was Margaret who gave her the second piece without knowing she was giving it. Frances had asked her on a Wednesday in early December about the history of the instrument acquisition, not because she expected the housekeeper to have legal knowledge, but because Margaret had been at the hall in 1802 and sometimes knew things that were not written down. Margaret had been ironing, which she did herself on Wednesdays despite having staff who could do it, because she found it useful to have something to do with her hands during certain conversations. And she had talked about the late Duke and his collection with the comfortable recollection of someone describing a period she remembered fondly. He was very particular about what he brought here, Margaret said, running the iron along a pillowcase with practiced efficiency. Every piece had a reason, nothing just for show. A pause, and then, she would have liked the keyboard instrument, I think. The one from the Suffolk sale. Frances looked up from her notes. Margaret set the iron down. The slight correction was visible in her posture, not a flinch, but the deliberate adjustment of someone who has said a version of something and is redirecting it. His late wife, she said. She was very musical. But of course the late Duchess, had passed some years before the Suffolk purchase. She picked up the iron again. I was thinking of her generally, as one does. Frances looked at her notes. She kept her expression attentive and neutral. Of course, she said. She did not ask who else Margaret might have been thinking of. She wrote nothing in her notes about the exchange. But she took out the program from her apron pocket that evening. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks, transferring it from apron, and looked at the pencil circle around her name and thought about what it meant that Margaret had caught herself, and what she had caught herself saying, and who the she might have been before the correction. She put the program away. She was not ready to look at it directly yet. The Flemish instrument book arrived from Ludlow on the 14th of December. It was an old volume, German text, with hand-drawn illustrations of instrument types across 3 centuries of Low Countries manufacture. Francis spent an afternoon with it, and the keyboard instrument, moving between the examination room and the cabinet with the careful attention of someone constructing an argument rather than simply satisfying curiosity. She examined the maker's mark inside the case, partially obscured by age, but legible enough, and compared it with the plates in the book. She measured the string spacing. She assessed the construction of the keys, the wood of the case, the style of the inlay. By 4 o'clock she knew what she had. The instrument was not Flemish. It was English, late 16th century, made by a maker whose marks were documented in the German volume as appearing on instruments of the period, now held in private collections of established significance. It was, in short, considerably more valuable than anyone had assessed it, which meant considerably more was at stake than she had fully understood. Augustus was in the stables when she found him. She waited in the stable doorway as she had learned to do, and when the natural pause came, she said, "The keyboard instrument. I know what it is." He came out into the doorway beside her. The December light was flat and cold, and she could see her own breath. She told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, rather than the way he was quiet when he had nothing to say, which were different qualities of silence that she had learned to distinguish. "Rupert knows," he said. It was not a question. "I think he knows more than he has said," she said. "The specifics, perhaps not. But he has someone advises him who has assessed the collection and flagged the instrument as significant." The 4 minutes he spent at the cabinet in December were not casual. "Then we need the registered document," Augustus said, "and we need it before he files formally." "I know where to look," she said. "The parish records office in Ludlow. If your father registered any instrument purchases as additions to the estate inventory, as property entailed to the title, it would be there. Men who were careful about their collections were sometimes careful about this." He looked at her. The expression was the unclassified one, the one she had been accumulating without resolving. "When?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "If you can spare the carriage." "Take it," he said. She went inside. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard the dinner bell from the kitchen and remembered that Rupert Crail was still in the house, and that there were 2 more days of his visit remaining, and that she would need to sit across from him at table this evening and say nothing about what she had just confirmed. She was good at saying nothing. She had been practicing for 22 years. The Shropshire Ladies' Society for Charitable Works held a winter-old gathering at the Bexley House on the 19th of December, and Frances went because not going would have been remarked upon, and because she found in the course of the morning 3 women whose conversation was worth having, and 1 piece of information she had not expected. The information came from Doria Ancroft, a widow, a distant connection of Frances's family by marriage, who had the particular frankness of someone who has learned, through experience, that a great deal of social difficulty can be avoided by simply saying the accurate thing, who sat beside her during the refreshment portion of the morning, and said, without particular preamble, "You are not what people expected." "What did they expect?" Frances asked. "Eleanor," Dorothea said, "and when they heard it was you instead, they expected someone who would be managed. Fenwick is not a man people expect to be surprised by his own household." Frances looked at her tea. Has he appeared surprised? Dorothea considered this. "He appeared at the Bexley dinner last month to be paying attention to what you said about the east pasture fencings in a way that suggested he had not heard it before and found it useful." She paused. "For him, I think that is a significant thing." Francis said nothing. The tea was good. Outside, the December rain had started again, and the windows of the Bexley drawing room were beginning to fog at the edges. Also, Dorothea said, in the tone of someone appending a minor observation, Rupert Crail was asking questions about your background at the Stein dinner last week, specifically about whether you had any legal standing to act on your husband's behalf in estate matters. Frances set her cup down. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest he is trying to establish whether your involvement in the instrument question can be formally discredited. Dorothea looked at her with the direct assessment of a woman who has decided Francis is worth being direct with. I thought you should know. Francis looked at the fogged window and thought about the parish records office in Ludlow and the morning she had spent there 4 days ago and the document she had found and what it meant that Rupert was already trying to establish the limits of her standing. Thank you, she said. That is useful. She went home and went directly to the East Library and took out the document she had brought back from the Paris office and read it again, as she had read it 4 times already, and was satisfied that what she had found was sufficient. Then she put it in the locked drawer of the examination room desk and kept working. That evening at dinner, when Rupert made a remark over the soup course about the challenges of establishing clear provenance for older items in mixed collections, and directed the remark at Augustus rather than her, she said, into the middle distance as though thinking aloud, provenance is rarely the difficulty. It is usually documentation. But when the documentation exists and is registered, the provenance follows directly. Rupert looked at her. She looked at her soup. Augustus, at the far end of the table, said nothing, but she heard him set down his spoon. Thomas Ancroft arrived at Fenwick Hall on a Tuesday in January without writing ahead, which was characteristic of Thomas, and which Francis had long since stopped expecting him to change. He arrived at 2 in the afternoon on a horse that needed rest, and with the expression of a man who has been composing a conversation in his head for some portion of a journey, and is not entirely confident it will go the way he has rehearsed it. He greeted Francis in the entrance hall with the slightly formal warmth of a brother who is also conducting business and has not yet separated the two, and he asked if Augustus was available, and she said she would find out, and she went to the study door and knocked and heard the single word that meant "come in." She told him Thomas was here. He looked up from the drainage report he had been reading and said, "Does he want to see you or me?" "Both, I think," she said. He mentioned the settlement terms. Augustus put down the report. "Then let us get it done," he said, which was how he approached most things, and which she had come to find clarifying rather than abrupt. They sat in the drawing room, the 3 of them, with tea that Thomas did not drink, and a fire that had been recently built up and was still establishing itself. Thomas had brought papers, which he set on the low table between them with the careful arrangement of a man who wants to appear organized and has made some effort toward it. He explained that he had been in discussion with Kessel's office about the remaining financial arrangements connected to the marriage settlement, specifically a clause regarding the release of a portion of the Ancroft assets that had been held in abeyance pending confirmation of certain conditions, and that there was a document he needed Frances to sign to confirm her residency and standing as Duchess of Fenwick, which would trigger the release. It was straightforward, and Frances said so, and reached for the document, and then Thomas reached for a second document beneath it and said, "There is also this. I thought you might want to see it, actually. I came across it when I was going through Father's papers last month." He put it on the table. It was a folded sheet, older than the settlement document, with the Kessel firm's seal on it, a different Kessel, Frances registered Kessel Sr., whose hand she recognized from the original debt correspondence. It was a draft. Not the final contract, but an earlier version, with annotations in the margins in 2 different inks, and she understood from the way Thomas set it down not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, simply placing it where both of them could see it, that he had read it and knew what was in it and had decided to bring it anyway, for reasons she had not yet identified. Augustus reached for it before she did. He picked it up and unfolded it and looked at it, and she watched his face, which did the thing it rarely did, went very still, in a specific way that was different from his ordinary stillness, the way a surface goes still when something beneath it has stopped moving rather than when nothing is moving at all. He read the main text, which was a version of the contract she recognized, with Eleanor's name in the relevant place. Then his eyes moved to the margin, and he stopped. She looked at Thomas. Thomas was looking at his tea with the expression of a man who has decided to be somewhere else in his attention for the next 30 seconds. She reached across and touched the edge of the document. Augustus did not pull it away. He held it so she could read it, and she read the margin note, which was in a different ink from the contract text, darker, applied at a different time. In a hand she had not seen before, but which was compressed and precise in a way she recognized from the estate documents she had been reading for 3 months. The note was 4 words and a name. It said, "This should be Francis." She read it twice. Then she looked at Augustus. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her since she reached for the document. And the expression on his face was the unclassified one, the one she had been accumulating since the first week at Fenwick Hall, the one she had not resolved, and she understood now, looking at it directly rather than from the peripheral angle she had been using, that it was not unclassifiable at all. She simply had not wanted to classify it because classification would require her to do something with it. "This was sent to Kessel's," she said. It was not a question, but she asked it as one because she wanted him to answer. A version of it, Augustus said. He set the document down between them. The draft was sent in August, with a note to the clerk asking that the name be amended before the final version was prepared. She looked at the document and then at him. It was not amended, no, a pause, short and complete. "I assumed the request had not been received. I did not follow it. I should have followed it." Thomas had become very interested in the fire. "Why did you not say so?" she said, at the signing. He looked at her steadily. "You arrived," he said, "and I thought if I raised it then, in Kessel's offices, with your father and your brother present, and you had not been told and did not want." He stopped. "I thought it would be worse. To say it in front of everyone and have it be unwanted." She sat with this for a moment. Across the room, the fire had found its stride and was burning with the steady warmth of something that has settled into itself. Thomas was examining the middle distance with the total absorption of a man who has disqualifications and is not his to participate in, which was the most tactful thing she had ever seen her brother do. "So you signed," she said, without saying anything. "Yes," he said. "Because you thought saying it would be worse than not saying it." "Yes," he said again, and the flatness of it, the complete absence of self-defense, was the most honest thing she had heard him say, which was, she was beginning to understand, how he operated. Not constructed honesty, but the honesty of a man who has simply run out of other options and has found, perhaps to his own surprise, that the truthful version is lighter to carry. She looked at the draft contract with its margin note and thought about the busyness of Kessel's office, and the clerk who had not passed on the amendment, and the sequence of impersonal administrative failures that had ended with her sitting in this drawing room in January, with the fire burning, and her brother cataloging the seats, and the man across from her, looking at her with the expression she had finally named. "Thomas," she said. Thomas looked at her with the alertness of a man recalled from self-imposed exile. "Was there anything else in Father's papers that related to this?" Thomas considered. He had, she knew, considered this question before he came, and his answer had already been decided. There was a letter, he said, from the Duke's solicitor to Kessel's office, dated August, speaking about the amendment. Kessel's replied that the contract was already in final preparation. He paused. I can send it to you if it would be useful. Yes, she said, send it. Thomas stood with the relief of a man whose portion of a difficult conversation is over, and said he would need to be getting back before dark. And Francis walked him to the entrance hall and received his awkward but genuine embrace, and watched him ride away down the Fenwick Drive in the January gray, and stood in the doorway for a moment after he was gone. When she came back to the drawing room, Augustus was still there. He had not gone back to the drainage report. He was sitting in the same chair looking at the fire, and he looked up when she came in, and she sat down across from him, and the draft contract with its forward margin note was still on the low table between them. She did not decline, Francis said. Eleanor, she was ill, I know, he said. If she had not been ill, I would have said something, he said. At the office, before the signing, he looked at the fire. I decided, on the journey to Ludlow, that I would say it regardless of who was there. That the amendment had not been made and I wished to raise it. A pause. Then you walked in, she looked at him. And I did not say it, he said. Because you walked in and sat down, and you looked at the room the way you look at problems. Like you were already working out where to begin. He stopped. I thought if I raised it and you left, I would have another pause. The pauses in his speech were not uncertainty. They were selection. He was choosing, each time, the accurate word rather than the available one. I thought I would have made it worse in a different direction. The fire settled. Somewhere outside a door closed in the wind. Francis looked at the draft contract and the 4 words in darker ink and thought about the program in her apron pocket with its pencil circle and the morning in the East Library 3 months ago when she had found it, and all the evenings since of sitting in the same room, reading in the same silence, and the 8:30 knock and the question about the library that had been asked and answered before either of them had words for why it mattered. Rupert is filing formally, she said. The shift was slight, but she saw it the return to the practical register, but not as an escape from the other, as a continuation of it. When Dorothea Ancroft had word from the Stein household. He engaged a Ludlow solicitor last week. He will file before the end of the month. She looked at the document on the table. I have the registered document from the parish records office. I have the personal inventory. I have the Flemish volume and my examination notes. But when I brought the registered document to Kessel's last week, they said it was not sufficient without an independent attestation of my standing to act on estate matters. She paused. Rupert has apparently suggested to the relevant parties that my role in the cataloging was informal, and my findings therefore not disinterested. Augustus looked at her for a long moment. The expression had settled into something that was still the named one, but with another layer beneath it, the layer of a man who has understood the full shape of a situation and is deciding what it requires of him. He is arguing that you have a personal interest in the outcome. Yes, because you do, he said, not as an accusation. As a fact they were both looking at together. Yes, she said, I do. He stood. He went to the window and stood looking out at the January park, with his hands behind his back in the posture he used when he was not pacing but needed to move something. She waited because she had learned that his silences were working silences. I will need to go to Ludlow, he said. I know, before he files, and I will need to. He stopped. A longer pause than his usual ones. There is something I will need to say. Before the sitting, publicly. He turned from the window. It will not be comfortable. She looked at him. I should have said it louder, she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, with the precision of a man confirming that something has been understood, yes. She looked at the fire. He looked at her. The draft contract sat between them on the low table with its 4 words in darker ink, and outside the January light was failing in the long, slow way of a winter afternoon that has decided it has lasted long enough, and neither of them said anything further because nothing further was needed yet, and they had both learned, by now, that the space between what has been said and what comes next is not emptiness but a kind of preparation, and that it is better not to rush it. From the East Library, faintly, through two closed doors and the length of the corridor, came the sound of the wind against the tall windows, the ones with the humidity problem, the ones she had asked him about at their first dinner, the ones that were still, 3 months later, on the list of things to be addressed. She thought she would address them in the spring. She thought, with a clarity she had not expected, that she would be here in the spring. 8:30 tomorrow, he said. Yes, she said. He went back to his study. She went to the East Library. She unlocked the drawer and took out the registered document and butted it one more time in the last of the afternoon light, and then she put it away and picked up the personal inventory and kept working. There was still work to do, and because this was, she had understood for some time now, simply who she was: the woman who found the document in the vestry, who read the maker's mark, who kept the column of figures, who arrived at the problem at 8:30 and did not leave until it was solved, and this was not, she thought, a small thing to be. The Ludlow Parish Records Office opened at 9 o'clock on weekday mornings, which Frances had established on her visit in December, and which meant that the carriage needed to leave Fenwick Hall by 7:30 if she was to be there when the clerk unlocked the door, and before the morning's other business accumulated. She had made this journey twice already. She knew the road, the particular section where the ruts were worst, the point at which Ludlow's rooftops became visible above the tree line, the expression on the clerk's face when a woman arrived with specific questions about registered estate documents, an expression that moved, over the course of a conversation, from mild skepticism to cautious interest to the particular approval of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a person who knows what they are looking for and why. On the third visit she went alone, without Nan, because Nan had a cold and because Frances had decided, at 5 o'clock that morning, while lying in the dark listening to the wind, that she would prefer to do this particular errand without having to manage anyone else's comfort. She took the registered document from the locked drawer. She took the personal inventory, wrapped in cloth. She took her examination notes, fair copied into a bound notebook. She took the letter Thomas had sent, the one from August 1815, in which Augustus's solicitor had written to Kessel's asking about the amendment. She put all of these in a leather case that had been Augustus's, and that she had found in the East Library and appropriated for document transport without asking, because it was exactly the right size and he would not have minded. The clerk at the parish records office was named Watt, and he was 60-something and had the unhurried precision of a man who had worked with official documents for long enough to know that they mattered, and that rushing them made them matter less. She spread her materials on his desk and explained what she had and what she needed. She needed the registered document, formally certified as valid, not just registered, but confirmed as pertaining to the instruments listed, with Watt's attestation that the registration predated any dispute. She needed this attestation witnessed by a second party. Watt read the registered document. He read it again. He examined the inventory. He compared the instrument descriptions in the inventory against the registration language with the methodical attentions of someone who is not going to be rushed and knows it. Then he said, with the careful precision of a man delivering a useful piece of news in a neutral tone, the registration is valid and the document is what it represents itself to be. I can certify that. And the witness, Frances said. Watt looked at her over his spectacles. I can certify. But the certification requires a second signature, someone of legal standing who can attest to the document's authenticity in a formal proceeding. He paused. A solicitor, or a magistrate, or he paused again with the slight hesitation of someone who is about to say something accurate that they expect to be inconvenient, a party to the original estate. The title holder. She looked at the desk. She looked at her materials, precisely laid out, correctly prepared, legally sound in every respect except this one, which was the respect that Rupert Crail's solicitor had identified and targeted. Because of course, it was of course the one thing she could not supply herself was the one thing required. She had thought she could work around it. She had thought the registered document alone with her examination notes and the personal inventory and Thomas's letter would be sufficient to establish the claim without requiring Augustus to appear in a formal proceeding and say what he had not yet said publicly. She had been wrong. "I understand," she said. She packed her materials back into the leather case with the same care she had unpacked them. She thanked Watt, who said nothing but whose expression held the particular sympathy of a man who cannot change a procedural requirement and knows it and feels the limitation of that. She went outside into the January cold and stood on the Ludlow Market Street with the leather case under her arm. She had until the end of the month. Rupert was filing before the end of the month. Without the certification, the registered document was sufficient to register a claim, but not sufficient to preempt one, which meant if Rupert filed first, the question would go to a formal sitting, and the sitting would be a protracted proceeding in which her findings could be challenged precisely as Rupert's solicitor intended to challenge them, as the interested work of an interested party. She stood on the Market Street for perhaps 5 minutes. She was not despairing, she had learned, over 22 years of being the one who solved things. That despair was a luxury she could not afford until she had confirmed there was no next step, and she had not confirmed that yet. She had confirmed only that the next step was not one she could take by herself. She went home. She did not go to Augustus directly. She went to the East Library and put the leather case in the locked drawer and sat down at the examination table with the bound notebook open in front of her and wrote nothing in it for 20 minutes because she was thinking about the drawing room and the draft contract and 4 words in darker ink and about the difference between knowing what a thing means and knowing what to do with what it means and whether she was permitted to ask him for this. She was still sitting at the examination table when she heard his voice in the corridor brief to Margaret, something about the tenant accounts, and then his footsteps, and then the pause outside the East Library door that meant he had registered the light under it and was deciding whether to come in. She said without raising her voice, "Come in if you want." He came in. He looked at her at the examination table with the open blank notebook and the expression of a woman who has returned from somewhere and has something to say, and he sat down in the chair across from her, the one that had migrated into the East Library over the course of December and January, and was now simply there, as though it had always been there, and he waited. She told him about Watt's requirement. She told him what it meant and what it would require. She told him precisely and without softening that to provide the certification in time he would need to appear before the magistrates sitting as a party to the original estate and attest to the validity of the registration, and that in doing so he would need to address on the record the question of how the collection had been managed and what his own role in that management had been, because Rupert's solicitor would raise it and the sitting would require an answer. She said, "You would need to say publicly that you did not review the collection's documentation yourself, that this was an oversight, that the work of establishing its legal status fell to someone else because you had not done it when you should have." He said nothing, she continued. "Rupert will use it," she said. "He will say that the estate has been poorly managed and that any documentation produced under those conditions is suspect. It will not succeed. The registered document predates my involvement entirely, and its validity does not depend on me. But it will be said, and it will be on the record, and people will hear it." She stopped. He was looking at the middle distance with the working stillness. She waited. "Is there another way?" he said. "I have spent the morning establishing that there is not," she said. "I am sorry." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not quite pain, but in the neighborhood of it, the expression of a man who is examining the full cost of something and not allowing himself to look away from it. Then it's settled. The sitting is when? The magistrates sits on the 14th. Rupert's solicitor will file before then. If you attend on the 14th with the certification, we preempt the claim before the formal proceeding begins. Then I will be there on the 14th, he said. She looked at him. Augustus. He looked at her. You do not have to. She stopped, restarted. The collection matters. The instruments matter. But I am asking you to pay something significant for this, and I want to be certain that you, Francis, he said, not interrupting exactly, but arriving at the right place before she did. I should have managed it myself, years ago. Before it was a dispute, before Rupert had a solicitor, before you had to spend 3 months in a cold room cataloging things I should have catalogued. He paused, saying so publicly is accurate. Accurate things are not, generally, the ones that concern me. Then what concerns you, she said. He looked at the East Library window with its humidity problem, and then at the examination table, with its methodical stacks, and then at her, and the expression was fully the named one now, the one she had classified in the drawing room 3 days ago and had been sitting with since. That I will say something inaccurate, he said, by omission. And you will not know that I have omitted it, and I will have been given another opportunity to be more precise than I have previously been, and I will have wasted it. She looked at him steadily. Then be precise, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the examination room was low, and the afternoon light through the south-facing window was the thin winter light that lit things clearly without warming them. And she could see his face very well. And she thought she had always been able to see his face very well, even from across assembly rooms, even before she had any reason to be looking. I should have sent the amendment myself, he said, not through Kessel's. I should have gone to your father's house and said directly that the contract had the wrong name on it and that I wanted to correct it. I did not, because, he stopped, the selection pause. Because the year before I had said directly what I wanted, and it had not. He stopped again. She saw him make the decision to continue rather than redirect, which was, she understood, the precise thing he had said he wanted to do. Someone I wished to marry declined, before the title. Her family declined, on her behalf, and I was given to understand that when circumstances changed, I might reapply. When circumstances changed, she had already married someone else, and I understood from that what saying directly what one wants tends to produce. She sat with this for a moment. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud passed outside. So you wrote it in the margin, she said. Yes, and trusted a clerk to deliver it. Yes. The word was flat and entirely without self-defense. I was a coward about it. You were not brave about it, she said. That is not the same thing. He looked at her. Something in the line of his shoulders changed, not relaxing exactly, but releasing a tension that had been so constant she had not noticed it until it moved. No, he said. I suppose it is not. She looked at the blank page of the open notebook. She thought about 22 years of being useful and the specific, worn quality of a life built around not asking for anything, and the program in her apron pocket, and the knock on the door at 9:30 on the first evening, and what it had meant then, and what it meant now, and whether she had been waiting to know this before she let herself believe it, and whether she now knew it. She thought she did. She put her hand on the examination table between them, not reaching, simply placing. He looked at it, and then he put his hand over hers, and they sat in the East Library in the winter afternoon, with the thin, clear light and the methodical stacks and the locked drawer with its registered document, and she thought, I came here to be useful, and I am, and that is not why I am staying, and I know the difference, and that is enough. The magistrate sitting on the 14th of January was held, as all Ludlow magistrates' sittings were held, in the upper room of the market building, in the particular smell of grain and old timber, an official proceeding that had accumulated there over decades. Francis arrived with Watt's certification in the leather case, and Oliver Kessel, the younger Kessel, who had taken over his father's practice, and who had, once apprised of the situation, become notably cooperative beside her. Augustus arrived separately, having ridden from Fenwick Hall at dawn, and came up the stairs with the specific quality of stillness he carried when he had made a decision and was executing it. Rupert Crail was already there. He was sitting with his solicitor, a Ludlow man named Prine, who had the careful posture of someone expecting to win, and he looked at Frances when she entered, and then at Augustus and performed, briefly, the expression of a man who has found the opposition better prepared than anticipated and is deciding how to adjust his approach. He was not prepared for how well prepared they were. Watt's certification was presented first. It confirmed the registered document's validity, its date which predated not only Rupert's claim but Augustus's marriage, and its pertinence to the instruments listed in the personal inventory. Kessel presented the inventory. Frances presented her examination notes, 3 months of systematic cataloging, each instrument dated and attributed and cross-referenced to the registration. She spoke when the presiding magistrate asked her to speak and answered the questions put to her with the economy of someone who has rehearsed the accurate answer and does not need to embellish it. Rupert's solicitor objected to her standing. He argued with the polished precision of someone who has prepared this argument carefully that, as the Duke's wife, she had a personal interest in the outcome of the proceedings and that her findings could not be treated as independent attestation. Augustus spoke then. He stood in the way he stood when he was being accurate squarely, without performance, with the contained attention of a man who has decided what he is going to say and is saying it, and he confirmed that the cataloging had been conducted at his request, that Frances had identified and documented the registered estate document independently, that he had not reviewed the collection's documentation before her appointment, and that this was a failure of management on his part, and that the document's validity did not depend on her involvement because the document predated it by 13 years. He said it without apology and without self-exculpation, and with the level, exact voice of a man who has decided that accuracy is worth more than protection. And Frances, sitting beside Kessel, looked at her hands in her lap and thought about the drawing room and 4 words in darker ink, and felt something move through her chest that was not quite any one thing, but contained several things at once, and kept her face still. The solicitor pressed. He raised the question of management failures. Augustus had opened that door himself, had he not, and whether the estate's general condition of oversight reflected on the reliability of its documentation practices. Augustus said, "The document was registered by my father in 1802. My management of the estate began in 1811. The document's validity predates both my title and any question about my management of it. You are welcome to argue that my father was unreliable, but I would suggest that is a separate proceeding." One of the magistrates made a sound that might, in a less formal room, have been described as a laugh. Rupert spoke then, more directly than he had spoken previously, with the particular edge of a man who has watched his carefully constructed argument dismantle in front of him and has decided that a more aggressive position is his remaining option. He said that the collection had been promised informally, in the context of a private family conversation as part of the consideration for a debt arrangement, and that this promise predated the formal registration dispute and should be treated as a binding commitment. Frances said quietly and without raising her eyes from the document in front of her, "A promise made whom, to whom, and evidenced by what?" Rupert looked at her. The presiding magistrate looked at Rupert. Rupert's solicitor said that the promise had been conveyed verbally. Then Frances said, "It will need to be weighed against a registered estate document, a certified personal inventory, and 13 years of uncontested legal standing." She looked up. I am happy to wait while that weighing is conducted. She was not happy. She was very calm, which was a different thing, and the distinction was visible to everyone in the room who was paying attention, which was everyone. The magistrates conferred for 6 minutes. They returned with the confirmation that the collection was registered estate property, entailed to the title, not subject to disposition as personal property, and that the claim was denied. They noted, for the record, that the documentation presented had been thorough and clearly organized. Rupert's solicitor began to speak. The presiding magistrate looked at him over his spectacles in the manner of a man who has said what he has to say and does not intend to say more of it. The solicitor stopped. Rupert stood. He looked at Augustus, and then he looked at Frances, and she looked back at him with the specific composure of someone who has nothing further to conceal and has found, in that condition, a kind of steadiness she had not previously known she possessed. He looked away first. He went to the door, and his solicitor followed him, and the room redistributed itself around their departure with the natural ease of a space reordering itself after a thing that had been taking up too much of it is removed. Outside, on the Market Street, in the January cold that had developed a crispness suggesting the weather was about to change for the better, Frances stood with the leather case under her arm and breathed. Kessel was talking to Watt. The remaining magistrates were descending the stairs in a cluster of conversation. Augustus came to stand beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing, and she stood beside him and said nothing, which was also the right thing, and the cold was clean, and the sky above Ludlow's rooftops had the pale washed quality of a winter afternoon that is considering becoming something other than winter. She was in the East Library that evening when he came in. She had not gone there to work, she had gone there because it was where she went when she needed to think. And the examination table, with its cleared surface, and the locked drawer now permanently unlocked, and the instruments in their cabinets, documented and secure, was the room that made the most sense to her in the world of Fenwick Hall, because she had made it make sense, and that was still, even now, the thing she reached for first. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. He came to the table, and he set something on it. Not a document, not the leather case, not anything from the desk or the shelves. He set down the program, the Shrewsbury concert program, the one she had been carrying in her apron pocket since the first week of November, which she had left on the examination table this morning when she transferred it to her coat pocket for the journey to Ludlow and had apparently left behind. She looked at the program on the table. She looked at him. He sat down in the chair across from her. He put both hands flat on the table in the manner she recognized from the drawing room, and he looked at them for a moment, and then he looked at her. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "of the program." "I know what the program means," she said. "I know you know," he said. "That is not the same as my having said it." She looked at him. He looked back with the full named expression, and she thought about the east pasture fencing and the humidity windows and 8:30 and the question about the library and all the mornings since, and what it was to be asked what one preferred by someone who intended to be governed by the answer. "The concert was September of 1813, he said. "I was in Shrewsbury on estate business. Someone had put a program on the table at the coaching inn. I picked it up to read the name of the hall." He paused. "Your name was in the program. We had not met. I did not know who you were. I only knew that the name was there, and the concert was that evening, and I had no other engagement." He stopped. "You played the pianoforte. A set of variations by someone I did not recognize. You played them with the kind of attention that makes other people in the room stop talking without knowing why they have stopped." He looked at the program. "I kept the program. I don't know why. I had no expectation that it would." He stopped again. "Then at the Bexley dinner, 2 years later, someone introduced you, and I remembered the program." She sat with this. Outside the East Library windows, the January dark had settled fully, and the room was warm and lit by two lamps she had positioned for maximum working light, and the instruments in their cabinets cast small shadows against the glass. When you came into Kessel's office, she said, "You recognized me, yes. And you said nothing." "I said nothing," he said, "because you sat down and you looked at the contract the way you look at problems. You were already solving it, and I thought," he stopped. The selection pause, longer than usual. "I thought that if you were here and you were willing to be here, I would rather have you here than not, even if the reason you were here was not the reason I would have." He stopped a third time. He looked at his hands on the table. "I thought I would have time," he said, "to say it properly." And then time passed. She reached out and picked up the program and held it for a moment the way she had held it in the East Library in November when she first found this small folded piece of printed paper that had been somewhere and should not have been, and that had told her something before she was ready to hear it. Then she set it back down between them. "The keyboard instrument," she said. He looked up. "I would like to have it restored," she said, "properly. There is a man in Birmingham who works with historical instruments. I wrote to him last month. He believes it can be returned to playing condition without damage to its integrity." He looked at her. The expression had shifted again into the territory adjacent to the named one, which she was beginning to understand was its own category. "That will take some time," he said. "Several months," she said. "He would need to come and assess it first. Then we should write to him," he said, "and set a date." She nodded. She put the program in the pocket of her work apron, where it had lived for the past 3 months, and she looked at the examination table with its cleared surface and thought about spring, and the humidity windows, and the sets of variations she had not played since she left the Ancroft house, because there had been no instrument at Fenwick Hall that she had felt she could simply sit down at and play. "There is a pianoforte in the drawing room," she said. "I have not used it. It is tuned," he said. "I had it tuned in November." She looked at him. "In October," he corrected, with the precision of a man who is going to be accurate about the date, "before you arrived." She sat with this, the image of him instructing someone to tune an instrument in October, before the contract was signed, before she had arrived, before anything between them was said or confirmed, or even acknowledged as a direction they were moving in. She thought about what it meant to prepare a room for someone before you knew if they were coming, and what kind of hope that required, and whether she had, in her own way, been doing the same thing: the blue apron, the examination table, the column of notes in the bound notebook, all of it arranged around the quiet, persistent belief that the work was worth doing even before she knew what it was for. She thought she had. She thought they were, in this as in several things, more similar than either of them had understood at first. "Ask me again," she said. He looked at her. "The way you asked me that first evening," she said. "About the library. Ask me something like that." He was still for a moment. Then he said, "The pianoforte. Would you prefer to play in the evenings or in the mornings before the household is fully up?" "Mornings," she said, "before 8:30. "Then I will make sure the drawing room is not in use before 8:30, he said. "And in the evenings," she said, "I would not object to an audience. If the audience did not make remarks about pieces they did not recognize." "I make no remarks," he said. "I listen." "I know," she said. "That is why I said it." He looked at her across the examination table with the full expression in full light, and she looked back at him without the peripheral angle she had spent 3 months using, and the East Library was warm and the instruments were documented and the locked drawer was unlocked, and she thought, "This is a house I live in, and that is my doing as much as anyone's, and I did not know when I came here that this was what I was building, but I know now, and knowing now is sufficient." He put out his hand. She took it. It was the same gesture as in the drawing room 3 days ago, her hand placed toward his hand covering it, and it meant the same thing. and slightly more than the same thing, in the way that a repeated gesture accumulates meaning each time it is performed, and she thought that was a good principle for a life. The following morning, Frances came downstairs at 7:30 and sat at the pianoforte in the drawing room and played the same set of variations she had played in Shrewsbury in September of 1813, the ones by the composer he had not recognized, which she had played then for an audience she could not see past the stage lights, and which she played now in an empty room with the winter morning coming in through the east window. She played them straight through without stopping, the way she played when she was not performing, but simply play. And when she reached the end, sat for a moment with her hands still on the keys. Behind her, from the doorway, she heard him set something down on the small table inside the door, the sound of porcelain, light and precise. She did not turn around. She heard him sit down in the chair beside the table. She began the variations again from the beginning. On the table by the door, 2 cups of tea cooled to the right temperature in the morning light, beside the Shrewsbury concert program with its pencil circle around a name that had, after everything, turned out to be exactly the right name, in exactly the right place, only arrived at by a longer road than either of them had planned for, and no worse for it. This is not a story about a forced marriage. It is a story about a question asked at a door, and what it means when the question is the right one, and when the person asking it already knows what they hope the answer will be and asks anyway, because some things must be asked aloud to become real, and some doors must be knocked on before they can be opened, and the asking is not weakness but the bravest thing there is. Frances Ancroft was never meant to be the one who signed the contract. She was the contingency, the spare button, useful when something else was gone. She became, instead, the woman who read the maker's marks, found the registered document, and sat before a magistrate and dismantled a legal claim with 3 months of careful work and 13 years of uncontested evidence. Not because she was asked to be all of that, because she was. If this story stayed with you, please give us it. Like it tells us this kind of work is worth continuing. Share it with someone who understands that the most romantic thing in the English language is not a declaration but a question, asked simply and waited on. Subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you. Now the question we cannot settle. When Augustus had the pianoforte tuned in October, before Frances signed anything, before she had any reason to come, was that hope? Or was it presumption? And when she played the variations the next morning without turning around, was she forgiving him, or telling him the question had already been answered? Let us know in the comments. The next story arrives soon.